Good afternoon, and welcome to this noon forum presented by the Associated Student Speakers Program. Our guests for today's debate, resolved, Conservatism is a Threat to America, are Louis Lomax and John Rousselo. Mr. Lomax is a commentator and author. He has written The Negro Revolt and When the World is Given. He has received 2 honorary degrees for his work. Mr. Rousselo, former congressman, was the Director of Public Information for the Federal Housing Administration and the National Public Relations Director for the John Birch Society. The format of the debate will be this. Mr. Lomax, taking the affirmative, will speak for 10 minutes. Mr. Rousselo will speak for 10 minutes, at which point there will be a cross question and answer period between our 2 guests for 10 minutes and a summary statement of each for 5. Following their presentation, we will take questions from the floor. Those of you who have questions, please move to the front as this will be our break time. We have a microphone on the men's lounge side of the grand ballroom from which we will field your questions and answers. And now, for the affirmative, Mr. Lomax.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rousselo, members of the faculty and student body of UCLA and CIA agents who happen to be among us. I rise to speak to the affirmative of the proposition that conservatism is a threat, and I would add even stronger language, a definite, menacing threat to American society. Conservatism makes its fundamental error when it fails to understand the nature of man. It assumes man to be a static phenomenon, something incapable of ideological and, if you please, spiritual growth. And the end result is that Mr. Rousselo and his comrades of the right wind up prosecuting the proposition that all of the problems of 20th century America can be solved if we will only return to the liberalism of the 14th century. I stand to the contrary and say that man is an ever-growing, ever-changing thing. That which was no longer is, and that which is now will be gone tomorrow. And that the only way one can accurately arrive at a political philosophy, indeed the only way one can arrive at a sound philosophy of history, is to understand man for the ever-changing, ever-evolving thing that he really is, and to realize that over the periods of the years, ideologies will fall and new dogmas will come in their place. And the only thing that will remain constant is man himself. Man, as John Dewey would put it, man in change. I shall prosecute then only one point. I will say, and submit for your consideration, that conservatism is a threat to America principally because it frightens the daylights out of America by attempting to have America deal with symbolism rather than content. Conservatism is that kind of ideology, particularly as it is practiced in America, which gets us hung up on symbolic factors, begging us then to ignore the pragmatic reality, the content. They get hung up, for example, on the cross. And you walk down the street in Burbank, in Anaheim, and Glendale, Or you go to a meeting of Mr. Rousselo's illustrious organization, the John Birth Society, and everybody stands, his eyes filled with tears, looking up at the cross as it lifts up from the building and wafts its way into the clouds, and they bow before the cross. What they forget, that there was a man behind the cross, a man who was the greatest revolutionary to hit the globe in many a year, and certainly none have matched him since. It was a man who, first of all, Mr. Rousselo, didn't obey his local police. Instead, he went down to the well at Samaria and, pardon the expression, but integrated. And he staged the first drink-in human history. They forget that this man said, how can you love a God whom you know nothing about, whom you cannot possibly see, and you hate your neighbor whom you do see? But they are staring at the cross, they're looking at the symbol, but they don't concern themselves with the content. And one of the reasons why they get transfixed by the cross is because it allows them to become hypnotically involved, take a kind of spiritual LSD trip, and relieve themselves of the burden of doing what man was built to do, and that is to hack out a way of life in content and in context and sometimes in conflict with his neighbor. Another evidence of this, of course, in addition to the cross, is the flag. Oh, how they get hung up on the flag. It has never yet occurred to them that there's a difference between waving Old Glory and beating it to death. But they get hung up. And all of a sudden now the Congress of the United States is alive with legislation to make it a felony to burn the flag. Well, that's fine with me. But I am disturbed when people of Mr. Rousselo's persuasion say, let's go out and get these people who are protesting the war. And the Assistant Attorney General of the United States says, well, gee, there is something called the First Amendment. And Mr. Rivers of South Carolina says, to hell with the First Amendment, go get the draft dodgers, you see. They get hung up on the flag, not on the content. One would be glad to support a bill, and I will, to make it a felony to burn the flag. But I wish they would also make it a felony to violate the Constitution of the United States for which the flag stands. To put it bluntly, as someone did to me last night, the conservatives get all hung up on burning the flag, but they don't get hung up about burning people. The very conservatives, and particularly those from the Deep South, who are all on a froth now because somebody burned the flag, they were sitting in Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi during all of those years when Negroes were burned from limbs, and not one of them offered an amendment to the Constitution. Not one of them offered a new bill. In fact, they voted against every anti-lynch bill in history. You see, when you burn the flag, they get mad, but when you burn somebody, well, people don't matter. Indeed, let it be said bluntly of the conservatives, they are not anti-Negro. They are anti-people. I apply this then in three various categories where you can really see the sham of conservatism and how it so dangerously affects us. First area is that of the immoral, unprincipled, unwarranted, unnecessary, ungodly war that we're involved in Vietnam. The conservatives are saying, go in and win. Win what? If we were to level that poor country with atom bombs tomorrow, we would have what Ronald Reagan, the high prince of conservatism today, said he wanted, and that is a parking lot. We wouldn't conquer anything. you fellas would have to go over there and stay 25 years just to attend the parking lot. There is no win. The reality is we never should have been there in the first place. But the conservatives, of course, say go in and stop the communists at all costs, because evil and communism are one. There is no other distinction. If a thing is communist, it's evil. If it's evil, it's communist. But the strange thing is, if somebody who's a good God-fearing capitalist does something wrong to you, that's not wrong. But if a communist does it, it is wrong. I remember so very clearly once in my life, one of the members of the State Department had the unmitigated gall to tell me that he was worried about my going to Havana, Cuba, because he couldn't protect me in Havana. And I said to him, Mr. Russ, baby, you can't protect me here. I know you can't protect me in Cuba. And so, to make a point of it all, the conservatives will talk about individual rights. They'll talk about fiscal policy. They'll get hung up on flags and crosses. And in the process, they have led America to the brink of disaster. For ultimately, America is not a land of money. It's not a land of symbolisms. America is a land of people. And if America is to not only survive, not only endure, but prevail, then they must move to the liberal stance and become disciples of the gospel according to Barbara Streisand. People who need people are the luckiest people in the world.
Everybody. Mr. Chairman, members of the student body, faculty, and my very worthy and capable opponent in this discussion, Mr. Lomax. I first of all would like to thank the members of this student body and faculty for making it possible for two of us of differing points of view to have the opportunity to express these. This is part of our tradition. This is part of our ability to keep America strong. Let me say I feel a little bit like the time that Lyndon Baines Johnson and former President Eisenhower and Nixon were set adrift in a life raft because their ship had gone out from under them. And they were having some trouble deciding how the rations would be apportioned and what direction they would take, how they would chart their course. So because they were all used to operating in government activity, they decided to have a chosen leader. So they held an election, and sure enough, Lyndon Baines Johnson won 13-2. That's part of the problem we've had in the conservative movement sometimes. We've been counted out before we've even gotten there, but we appreciate this chance to express our ideas. We're perfectly willing to have them stand the test of public challenge because we believe we are correct. Now, Mr. Lomax takes the position that conservatism is a threat, I think he said a menace to America. I, of course, take the position that conservatism is a major constructive force in America today for some of the very reasons that Mr. Lomax was talking about. He said, or believes, that the conservative tends to be concerned more with the symbolism rather than the context. Exactly the opposite is true. The conservative today, the true liberal of today, is very much concerned with the context of the cross, as he speaks of it, or the flag, because of what they stand for. Not just a blind acceptance of standing in the room, and I'm sorry you've given the impression, I thought you knew our organization better than that the Birch Society has a cross in the room and that they all sit there and go gaga over the cross and are unconcerned about the symbolism and the true context of what that stands for as it relates to Jesus. Because we do consider him to be one of the great and fine revolutionaries of our time or past. And that and as a matter of fact, agree with you when he refused to support his local tyrannical police. Just as some people are today refusing to support tyranny under that little group called communism. You know, that lovely little group that slaughters thousands of people. And I know you don't support it, and I don't support it, but that's what the argument's all about. How can we prevent that from happening in our country? And that is why we believe that the conservative point of view is a more positive answer than what has become known as totalitarian liberalism that wants to put more and more controls, more and more force in a centralized government and disallow freedom for the people in this country. We are very much concerned with people in this country. But what this country is all about is people and their freedom. And how can we best protect that freedom? Now, we believe that government is not the only answer to our problems. And the reason that we are concerned about the people that burn the flag is not for the cost of the cloth that they have burned, but because they have shown a total disrespect for the context for which that flag stands, the very freedom that they have the right to burn the flag, maybe. And I agree with you, I would support legislation to make it a crime to burn the flag of the United States. That's one thing we would agree on. But we are as concerned about the context of what that flag stands for as you are. And that's what the disagreement is all about. Now, we take the position that conservatism is positive because it does not consider government to be our God. It is not the all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing master. It has to be checked. And you are correct when you say that we should be very much concerned about those who would disregard the Constitution, such as Lyndon Baines Johnson, when he sends 500,000 troops to Vietnam without the slightest scintilla of constitutional authority to do so, as Senator Morse has said. And he is right. The Constitution, and who is Mr. Johnson? He's one of the great proclaimed liberals. He says so. Well, don't get mad at me. That's what he says. Now, I agree with you. I think he's a phony liberal. I don't think he's a true liberal. I think he's just as phony as they come. And that's why I never voted for him. But the conservative movement didn't produce Lyndon Baines Johnson. He came from the, quote, Great Society, which is nothing more than an enumeration of words and deeds proclaimed by a man by the name of Wallace, if you'll pardon the expression, W-A-L-L-A-S, written in his book called The Great Society in 1915, a Fabian socialist from England. And Mr. Johnson is following that blueprint almost to the letter. Another form of totalitarianism. And that is what we object to. We believe that government is the servant, not the master of the people. We believe that government must therefore be bound by the Constitution or the laws as well as the people. That the Bobby Bakers, the Senator Dodds, the Congressman Powells must also be bound by that Constitution. There cannot be two sets of rules, one for the people and one for those in government. And if Congressman Rivers did say, and I do not believe that he did, the heck with the First Amendment, I've never heard him make that statement. If he did, he was wrong. And I'm sure most conservatives would challenge him, because the First Amendment is just as important to the conservatives as it is to the liberal. All phases of the Constitution are important. And so we agree, right here, that the Constitution must be abided by for all people, not just a select few. But part of the problem is that people who have obtained power in our country have misused those powers, and that is the concern of the conservative today. And the conservative force is far more constructive because it believes in the positive concept that freedom is important to all people, not just Lyndon Baines Johnson's ability to have one television station in Austin, Texas, by using government force to prevent others from getting a license in Austin, Texas. Now, Mr. Lomax very cleverly says, that the conservative is not concerned about burning people. We are, and he knows better than that. The conservatives didn't start the burning in Watts. They didn't. Those were rabble-rousers who claim to be from the liberal movement, but I don't even think they belong to the liberal movement. And I don't think the liberal movement really wants to claim them. The conservatives didn't start the agitation in Paterson, New Jersey. The conservatives did not start the agitation, and by the way, all this complaint in Watts and these other places was over jobs and housing. Who owns most of the houses in Harlem today? In Watts? Not the people who live there, but mostly, no, they're not. As a matter, let's talk about that. Do the conservatives own most of the property in Watts or the slums in Chicago? One of the biggest landowners today in Chicago is Saul Alinsky, and he has refused to remodel his buildings and is one of the greatest slumlords in Chicago today. That is a fact. A great liberal, part of your side. Who's another one? Two known communists in Chicago are large slumlord owners. Claude Lightfoot, one of the largest slum owners in Chicago today, a known communist, making money off of the poverty-stricken people that he claims he's for. The conservatives didn't start this. Your so-called liberal friends of the left. The largest number of property owners today in Harlem have never lived there are the rent collectors that live in the best places in New York. And check the records. They are not conservatives. They are the biggest contributors to the American Civil Liberties Union and all the rest. They don't practice what they preach, and that's our complaint. Thank you.
I think the next 10 to 12 minutes may prove very exciting. The gentlemen are going to cross-examine one another. I think Mr. Lomax will start with the first question directed across the table, and we'll take questions back and forth.
Mr. Rousselo, I would like to react to two things you said very briefly, and then see if we can deal with a question. You keep insist upon saying over and over that Lyndon Johnson says that he, Lyndon Johnson, is a liberal. Well, if Johnson said this is not the first time Johnson has failed to tell the truth.
That's right.
Now, you make quite a point. You've done this several times, and it kind of really disturbs me. Who started, when we get to talk about burning people, you always wind up talking about Watts. And we always know what you're saying. You're talking about the Negro, the black revolution, so to speak. Now, you say the conservatives didn't start it. Well, nobody started it. But if you want to nail it, I'll grab your argument and run with it. You did start it. Because Watts and Harlem, yes, you did.
No, I didn't.
They were all started. Well, let's see. Watts and Harlem were literally produced by people who went around yelling, "A man's home is his castle," and they voted yes on 14 and locked up a whole segment of American population in the ghetto. That's what started it. You see, this is what I mean by symbol versus content. You can run around and say the Negroes threw Molotov cocktails. You lucky. They didn't have machine guns.
Well,
and I
of
think we ought
course,
to get
some of
this-
them had guns and they
Indeed.
shot the firemen.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. But I think we ought to get
Come
this
on.
up on the table, and if you want to
Let's
hassle,
get it up on the
let's
table.
go.
Let's go. Let's get it right up here on
Right
the
now,
table.
well, let's start with who produced what, okay?
All right, let's talk about who produced what.
Right.
Patterson, New Jersey, and Harlem, New York.
The
and
whole
all the
schmear.
problem- The whole schmear.
The whole schmear.
Right. Proposition 14 never occurred in New York.
Its equivalent did.
No, it never has.
For
never
years-
been on the ballot.
The
As a matter of
equivalent
fact,
was.
they've had great, quote, civil rights laws that relates to housing for years in New York.
We know this, and then for years they didn't have it. But now
Oh,
let's nail it
but
down
before-
to some
but they've
concrete
had it
reality,
for
John.
some 20 years.
John, let's nail it down to
let's
concrete
get to
reality.
concrete reality. By all means.
Watts did not grow like Minerva, full blown from the head of Zeus.
Oh, I understand.
Somebody did it. Now, and the whole American tradition did it. You did it.
Wait
first-
a minute.
Yes, you
Wait
did.
a
Yes,
minute.
you
The
did.
whole American tradition?
The entire American tradition did it. You did it when you put people in slavery.
I
You
didn't
did it
put 'em
when-
in slavery.
Well, the system did.
And I, as a matter of fact, I reject slavery completely. And
I'm
to
sure
try-
you do now.
And to try to charge me with the responsibility of slavery is idiotic, and you know it is.
I'm not charging you.
Yeah. Well, then don't give me that jazz.
No.
All right.
I'm not charging you with the responsibility of slavery.
Well, you
but
almost did.
No, I'm not. What
No.
I am doing is something much more serious.
All
I
right.
am indicting you for accepting the responsibility to clear up the residuals of slavery. That's what I'm indicting you for.
I think we should clear that. I
Well,
think it's
right.
an important citizen responsibility.
Well, name me one thing the John Birch Society has done for civil rights.
Okay,
One.
fine. We have a Manning Johnson Scholarship Fund for all right. 1,000. Well, it's a start. I realize. For deserving Negroes to attend college of their choice, which we think is an important step. We think that education is a very important step in changing attitudes. And an important way is for more Negroes to enjoy the privilege of education. I think that's a positive step. Now, let me say this. You may make fun of the little scholarships we give out of $1,000 each, but Martin Luther King doesn't give any out, you know? Yeah. Well, that's right. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference spends over $500,000 a year, not one scholarship for deserving Negroes. To me, that is a positive step.
Well,
Okay.
I wouldn't take the position that I wouldn't take the position that the scholarship you pass out is to be sniffed at. I wouldn't say that at all. I wouldn't make this point, that it doesn't make sense to give out a scholarship to one or two deserving Negroes to try
Five.
to five, all right,
A year.
to try to turn them into instant Negroes.
No, we want them to
Now,
be
just a
instant
moment.
Americans.
Just a moment. When in reality, you don't go to the root of the problem. What good will it do a Negro to bat his brains out at UCLA for 4 years, only to come out into the Los Angeles job market and find that he faces discrimination, he can't buy a house? You see?
You want me to comment on that?
No, well, I want to finish. This is exactly my argument again, that you are dealing with symbolism. You want a Negro to have a PhD. Well, a Negro with
I
a
want him to have an
PhD, unless he
education.
has opportunities, is just another nigger.
Gee, that's awfully hard.
Well, no, it's true. It's true. It's true. It's true.
Gee, I wish you wouldn't talk about
No,
people
it's
that
true.
way. That's terrible.
It's true.
Gee, that's a nasty thing to say.
Indeed it is, but it's a true thing to say.
I don't agree with you
Well, I
that
do.
a Negro that graduates with a PhD is just another nigger. I think
didn't
that's
say
a
that.
terrible
I didn't
thing
say
to
that.
say. Well,
You see, you can burlesque the argument if you wish.
no, I'm not trying to burlesque
All
you.
right.
You started it.
Well, now, but here's what I said. I said a Negro with a PhD
Yes.
denied the fundamental opportunities to carry out the practice of that degree.
Right.
And I think the students understood my point. Society is still treating him like a nigger, and I think my point is valid.
On that issue, I
Well, of course,
understand
that's
what
all
you're
I
saying.
said.
Well, that isn't quite the way it came out. But
Well,
let me
you
just
know.
say this. I agree with you that if he has had the opportunity to gain a PhD and a good education, that if there are unwritten or improper restrictions that are silently placed against him, that this is wrong, and we must work to correct this, and I
Are we
agree
talking
with
about
that.
the same planet?
Yeah, we are. You were talking about his inability,
Mr. Rousselo, what
once
is the
he
position?
moved into private life, having left education,
Yeah.
to properly get ahead or to do the things that he must do because of unwritten restrictions and things like
Unwritten?
this. Well, all right.
Mr. Rousselo, what is the John Birch Society's position on open housing?
Well, we believe in open housing. We believe that everybody should have a chance to buy a house.
Did you urge no on 14?
Oh, no, because that is not what 14 was about. It was not open housing. It was the question of the right of individuals.
To discriminate?
No. No, it isn't. That isn't right. It is the right of an individual to enter into a mutual pact to sell his house, and that is a free choice under our Constitution, and I believe in abiding by that, too.
In other words,
you can't be forced to sell your house to a Ku Klux Klaner or a Bircher, maybe say, in your new $75,000 house up on the hill, you know.
Well,
And so, and I've noticed all the disadvantages you've had in this terrible country. You didn't have to go to KTTV and say, hey, look, give me a television program, I'll burn your transmitter down. You didn't have to do that. You have a fine home. Now, I'm not making light of this, but you've also... Wait just a minute. My goodness. I am trying to say that it is just as important in the right of property for free choice to exist between the parties of the buyer and the seller as it is in any other function that we have under our Constitution.
All right.
Now, do I believe that there should be restricted covenants on property? No, I do not believe that, and I think the Supreme Court has generally challenged that, and successfully.
all right, now, since you persist in making the point and involving me in it, let's see where we go on this.
All right?
I would be the first to say that in terms of not only the Negro, but I would suspect in terms of America generally, that my private instance is an exception. But now, since you keep on talking about me, let's see how real this thing is. The house you talk about, which was miswritten about in a magazine a year ago, and you've been quoting that bad figure ever since. So let me tell you once and for all, I've sold the house and moved, so don't use that anymore. I don't live there anymore. Now,
Well, do you have a better house, or what?
No. But I want to make a point. I want to make a point which some people in this room can verify. When I sold the house, I moved to an apartment in Bel Air. And a very interesting
Are you living in Bel Air now?
Yes. And a very interesting thing happened. No. Now, you need to hear this because it's
I'm
listening. It's the makings of something. When I sat down with the landlord, the woman, to rent the apartment, the woman said to me, Mr. Lomax, I admire your work. I'll be glad to rent you the apartment. She said, but I want you to make me a promise. I said, what is that? She said, when you move in, if I lose tenants as a result, I want you to promise me to pack up and move out. That was 5 months ago.
That was a stupid landlord.
No, it's a real one.
Oh. Did you agree to that?
No,
Oh, I don't blame you.
no,
I think
but
that
you see,
would have been
but this is what I'm talking about when you talk about
But
the
did she let you
content of
move
the-
in without agreeing to that?
I beg your pardon?
Did she let you move in without your
Well, she didn't put that in the lease.
Well, she didn't make you agree to it. You just
No, I
said you
wouldn't
said
agree
you
to it.
didn't agree to it.
But I'm saying
So
that these are the
you
kinds of
proved
things-
that it won't stand up.
No, but you see, John, I'm saying, and I think, you know, you can whistle around the cemetery, but I think we
not
all
whistling.
know,
I don't want to whistle at all.
I think we all know that in this country, right here in L.A., we are facing critical kinds of problems.
Yep.
And I think to come right down to the bone of it, we have to tackle these things, and I think it is the role of government, and I would like to end my part of this exchange on this point because you make it so frequently. Too much power in the hands of government. As for me, I adopt, in part at least, the Hobbesian notion of the function of government. I create government as an individual to literally keep me from thee and thee from me. And I invest in the government the right to regulate. Now, I do not follow Hobbes to the point that finally makes him tyrannical and that he goes into what I suspect is a form of fascism. But I will say this, and I believe it very firmly, that it is the function of government to say, look it, if you're going to build your house out of federal money, no discrimination.
Oh, absolutely.
All
I
right.
agree to that.
And I think it's the function of government also to say something else to you. If you put your house up for sale, obviously it's no longer your castle. You wouldn't be selling it. Now, if you're going to sell it, what difference does it make? What difference would it make to me whether a member of the Ku Klux Klan, the Mafia, or the John Birch Society bought the house? I'm leaving the community anyway.
Well, now, you see, I don't think you're being completely fair either to yourself or to others in this matter of free choice. When you sold your $75,000 home, let's say that there was somebody of the Jewish faith next door. I don't think you would have sold that to a Nazi if that was the case, because you would have felt that would have been poor taste, and you had the right to make that free choice. That's all. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
And that right of free choice should be protected.
But well, you see, let's take 1 minute. That could lead to danger. Because now what you're saying is this, if I follow your logic. My next door neighbor is Jewish. If I sell my house to a member of the Nazi Party, this would be in poor taste because the Jew will not like it.
But you have a legal right to sell it to the Nazi. I'm not arguing that.
Let's extrapolate and see where your argument goes. Suppose my next door neighbor is a Catholic.
Yeah.
Now, before I can sell my house, I got to sit down and say, now, gee, wonder what does this Catholic guy want? Suppose my next door neighbor happens to be an Arab. Now, the Jews got a problem. You see, I think it's a kind of circular argument, and I do not accept it.
But wait a minute. I say you have the right to make that choice in the sale.
I don't think I have the right.
Do.
I don't think I have the right. If I put my house up for sale, I don't think I have a right to inquire into a man's politics or a man's religion or a man's race. The house is for sale for 40 cents,
Let me say I
and if
agree
he
on
wants
the
to
race.
buy it, let him have it.
Let me say I agree with you completely. That,
Even George Lincoln
that you do
Rockwell
not,
has the right to have a house.
Well, you sure didn't sell it to him, did you?
I don't know who
No,
bought it, frankly. I
no.
put it up through a broker. I've never seen the purchaser.
Well, what I'm saying is I think that if George Lincoln Rockwell went to buy your home, you'd be a little hesitant maybe. You might be more selective.
I couldn't
If you had-
and be consonant with what I believe. I don't think I could.
Oh, okay. Well, we have a difference of opinion. Let me say, I want to make it clear, it would be my free choice not to sell it to George Lincoln. I just don't think he'd be a good neighbor.
The gentlemen will each make a concluding remark of 4 minutes, and then we will open up for questions from that side. Mr. Lomax?
My summary position is little more than a resume of my original statement. I believe that the problem we face in this country is a problem of content, a question of carrying out what is inherent in the founding documents of this country as over against becoming involved with the symbolism. There was a classic example of this point on my television program recently, and many of you may have seen it because it involved a student from UCLA. The young man who really, of course, is in Mr. Rousselo's corner. He's head of the Young Americans for Freedom here at this university. And not only did he take the occasion of being on my program to fire somebody from his organization on the air, but he looked at me during the commercial and he said, how does one join the NAACP? And I told him, and he said, well, I don't believe in what the NAACP is doing, but I want to join because I plan to run for public office and it will be a good thing for me to have on my record. Now, it's this kind of thing, this kind of playing with the deep emotions and the deep spirits of the American people that I think the conservatives have led us to today. And as a result, I believe we have found ourselves trapped in an endless war. We found ourselves engulfed with a domestic problem where people are actually arguing over the right of a man to vote. And yet, somehow we think we can bring freedom to Vietnam. And one wonders what happened to America to lead us to the position of assuming that we can export that which we do not grow. And nothing is more frightening than to go, as I recently have gone, into Southeast Asia, and to see a Negro from Mississippi standing up in the middle of a rice field to bring the freedom of vote to somebody in Southeast Asia, and that poor man can't even vote when he goes back home. Now, these are the kinds of troubling problems. And I say of my conservative friends, you've given us symbolism, but you've not given us answers. You've never launched one thoroughgoing civil rights program. You've never, as a conservative, come up with any suggestion as to how to solve the question of poverty and inequity in our society. Indeed, the liberals have bungled. Indeed, there have been mistakes. But most of all, we liberals have tried. The poverty program is a long ways from perfect, but it's there. Were it left to the conservatives, it wouldn't be there at all. The civil rights movement has not achieved all of its goals, but it's there. And had it been left to the conservatives, there would be no movement at all. And I say that out of this imperfection of liberalism, that a movement will still spread. And I believe, frankly, that the burden ultimately will rest upon young people such as you who are sitting here today. And I think when we look back upon this free exchange of ideas, you will realize that America is a nation of people in process, a nation of people in change, that we will not go back to yesterday, but that we will go forward to tomorrow. Thank you very much.
First of all, I would again like to thank the student body for making it possible for us to exchange these views. I'd like to compliment my opponent because he is a very worthy spokesman for his cause, and I know that many people, even those who disagree, feel that he is making a contribution because he is forcing people to think, and this is important. We agree that the basic concern of both conservatives and liberals in this country is the content and not just the symbolism of whether it's the flag, the cross, or whatever. But the content must be considered, the content of the Constitution and its meaning to our freedom. The conservative movement is today growing because people realize that the conservative movement is concerned with people and their freedom, and that both concepts need to be concerned, not just as people. Tyrants always claim to be interested in people. Hitler came to power on the basis that he was concerned for the German people. Mussolini, that he was going to lead the Italians out of all kinds of disasters. Communism came to help people. But of course the method which was used was totally distasteful to both of us. So we must not only be concerned with the people, but the whole atmosphere of freedom in which they flourish. We believe that conservatism is more concerned with the concept of freedom because it is not as willing to allow government power to be used where constitutionally it should and cannot be used, or where it will deny freedom. My worthy opponent mentions that he saw a man, a Negro in Vietnam, who was there to export freedom when he didn't have the right to vote at home. He had the right to vote, but it was not properly allowed to be exercised, and that has to be corrected. We agree. But that doesn't stop our effort internationally to try to export freedom, because I do believe that it is a precious commodity, and most conservatives do, that we do have the right to export as a concept. Now the gentleman says, what have we done for poverty? The conservative movement is very concerned about poverty. As a matter of fact, Chad McClellan, a man of the Chamber of Commerce, and I know there's always laughter and ho, 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 set up a committee with industry that has provided 22,000 new jobs in Watts. How many did the poverty program find? 2,000. Who's done better? The private institution has done far better than, as Gus Hawkins has pointed out, has done far better than the so-called poverty program of the government. And I think that is proof positive that conservatives are concerned, and they don't just talk about it and spend government money to do it, they do it. And I think that's the proof. Thank you very much.
We'll have a break for a few moments. Those of you who would like to ask questions or just planning on staying and listening to the answers to those questions, if you'll come up towards the front, there's a microphone on the men's lounge side of the grand ballroom.
Yeah.
Right from the 1 o'clock, someone at 1 o'clock will come in.
Good.
Is it permissible to smoke in here?
Haven't seen smoke. Sign for no smoking. I'm just reading you the sign. That is my opinion.
That's okay. Well, what are you going to do?
I guess I'm going to own consulting work, looks like. For myself.
Those who are interested in staying for the question and answer period, please come up towards the front so the speakers can more address themselves to you as a group and not dispersed through this
You were
entire
on
large
Channel 4
hall.
the other day, weren't you?
Yeah, on the press conference, right.
Uh-huh.
I'm doing some consulting work in franchising. I don't know how that's going to work out, but I took them along. It's just gotten to be quite a deal.
Yeah.
Last time they hung out at the rafters, the guy who runs this place had Timothy Leary spoke. We had to man the janitors at the back side because people were breaking through the wings of the backstage and coming around.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Been some discussion about running for Congress down against Hannah. Well, I don't know. I'd have to move the family or which it is.
where is this district?
Northern Orange County. You know Dick Hannah?
Oh, yeah.
There's been some talk about that.
What's
Hey,
the
listen.
vote?
Pardon?
What's the vote?
It's
Registration.
about 125,000 Democrats to 118,000 Republicans. I've never run in a district that good for Republicans.
Really? Your old district was worse?
Oh, in 1960, I had 30,000 more Democrats than Republicans.
Gentlemen, what we're going to do is we'll have one question directed to each of you. The other may comment.
Fine.
As long as we just try to keep that down.
And we'll keep our comments to the short comments.
Yeah. That would be, that might be interesting.
The questions will be asked alternately to each speaker, with the other speaker commenting after the first response. And we'll alternate questions back and forth as time permits. Please make your questions direct and as short as possible. That way more people will be able to ask their questions. Go ahead, sir.
This is to Mr. Rousselo. In regard to Proposition 14, I heard a comment last quarter from a professor, I think who borrowed it from another professor, and went to the effect that the very, very right conservatives subordinate human rights to property rights, whereas just the average conservatives equate them. I wondered if you'd comment on that.
John?
Yeah, can we do it here? Well, first of all, a conservative does not subordinate human rights to property rights because property right is an important human right and protected under our Constitution. All human rights are important, guaranteed under the Constitution. The right of free speech, the right of freedom of religion, the right of free press. All of these human freedoms are important, and that includes the right of property. Now, Mr. Lomax mentions that we consider a home our castle. I really have never thought of it as a castle. I think that it belongs to each individual, but that is his right to have the kind of home that he wants, and that is a human right guaranteed to him under the Constitution, and it is not any more important than the others. But they're all equally important, and that's the way I think most conservatives that I know consider it.
But I think this goes to the oblique of the question. As long as the man is staying in the house, no argument. What we're talking about is the availability of the house to all people when he is leaving it.
Right.
Now, I just cannot go along with you to say that property value or property right is to be equated in this instance with a human right. We're talking about the freedom and the right of an individual to buy a shelter over his head commensurate with his income.
To buy or sell.
To buy or sell.
Right.
Now, the point being, if you are moving out, and I make it over and over again, you are leaving. Now, what's the problem? How is one violating your human right to have property when you're selling it? I don't see any violation of your rights at all. You're leaving it. I really don't.
You
I don't
have
follow
the
you.
right to enter in. Well, your rights are protected as to the sale of that as well as to your buying. Now, I agree with you that if there is federal money involved, the federal government has every right to clearly outline how those funds shall be used. I agree with that. They're equal rights is my point.
This is addressed to Mr. Lomax, but I hope Mr. Rousselo answers as well. Both you gentlemen have come out against slavery, which is an amazingly progressive stand at this time. And I was wondering what is your position on an equally noxious form of slavery that exists today and that threatens many students, and that is the draft, an institution which takes a young man out of his home, forces him into the Army for 5 years against his will. What is your position on the draft? 5, yeah.
My own view on the draft is this. I believe that if a student, if an American, for whatever reasons, does not wish to participate in the Army to fight, that he ought to be allowed an alternative role. I do believe that every American must assume some of the responsibilities of his country when his country is in conflict, regardless of how the conflict has been produced. We cannot operate a society in which people will be allowed to enjoy the fruits of freedom and the fruits of the society without bearing some of the responsibilities of the society. I do not believe that a young man who has real hang-ups about war, for example, in the case of Cassius Clay, I think Cassius Clay is a marvelous example of a man living by his conscience. This man has given up fame, fortune, and his profession for the sake of his conscience, which up until he did it was a very noteworthy and meritorious thing to do in American society. It isn't anymore, it's subversive. But I do believe that people ought to be given an alternative.
I think I would go even further to the fundamental problem. I don't believe in compulsory draft, never have. And as a matter of fact, many conservatives don't, because it's a form of compulsion that is not correct. I believe that there are more than adequate numbers of people in our country who would voluntarily serve. The Marine Corps and others are clear examples of this. And I don't believe that I think that compulsory draft, the so-called universal draft programs, I believe myself, are unconstitutional. That is my position, and I think it's more fundamental than the position that Mr. Lomax has taken.
I think so too.
I think that there is a responsibility of every citizen to be responsible as it relates to his country. But I do not believe that a compulsory draft bill really stands up under the Constitution.
I'd like to direct this to Mr. Rousselo. I'd like to know why you have such a difference in your attitude towards regulation of business and regulation of the individual. I mean that conservatives become very upset when there's any talk of regulating the economy, regulating business, big business, and yet you're so in favor of laws regulating such entirely personal things as abortion, how you dress, the way you wear your hair in school, your sex life, and what kind of things you choose to take in the way of drugs or liquor. Where's this double standard come from?
Well, Madam, you've done a fine job of claiming that I'm for things that I've never stated I'm for. I think you've got a problem in not understanding the conservative point of view. First of all, let me say I've never favored the government regulating sex life. Let's get right to that point right now. And I think that it would be entirely improper, incorrect, and unconstitutional. Now, you mention abortion laws. I must say that I am very reluctant myself to have government imposing various laws as it relates to this subject when, say, a doctor and a patient and so forth would have very specific, not only just medical reasons, but other reasons. And I'm not sure that we can by law determine when life begins or when it stops. And I'm not sure that that issue can be regulated. Now, to answer your question very specifically, you say, why are we so ready, conservatives, and this is your claim, and let me say I do not believe it to be a correct claim. The conservatives are so willing to have individuals regulated by some of the instances you claimed we take a position on, and yet not have business regulated. Business and individuals are equally important. There shouldn't be laws favoring one or the other. They are all either individual entities or individuals that both should be considered equally. So to answer your question, I don't favor government regulation in any area that they do not have the constitutional authority to regulate. Now, I do believe, for instance, let's take the area of traffic laws. I think that's necessary because we have some people that want to drive down the wrong side, or we have to have some order as it relates to traffic. And we very much support, and this relates to business then too. But to claim that we want to see regulation on just individuals and not business is not to understand the conservative mind and is totally incorrect.
Well, I want to underscore again, running through Mr. Rousselo's argument, this recurring tendency to equate money with people, property with humans, like all of them are all the same things.
Oh, we didn't ever say they were the same.
Now, just a moment. I didn't say you said they're all the same things, but you keep saying they're equally important. And I think the questions are being raised whether there is a either or, and I think there is. And I put people over property. And I do not find myself being able to equate property values with human rights. I think this is evidenced in something else.
Then you disagree with the Constitution in that instance.
I beg your pardon?
You disagree
No,
that
no,
property right is an important human right.
Oh, I think it's an important human right, but I do not think it is the thing that we ought to be concerned with.
Oh, I agree.
Now,
it's just one thing.
But now, let's see. I want to go to this question raised by the young lady about regulating business. Mr. Rousselo made the rather interesting statement that Chad McClellan of the LA Chamber of Commerce went out and got 20,000 jobs in Watts.
Not by himself.
But not by himself. Okay, now, there are 2 points. The 2 points. Of course, if you go into Watts, you will find nobody who will agree with you that this occurred. But
Nobody?
But just a moment.
Nobody?
That's right. Not a soul.
Not even the
In fact,
22,000 who got the jobs.
in fact, it didn't happen.
Oh,
But let's assume it did.
you're calling him a liar.
Yes.
Oh.
And I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one.
We got the record straight on that.
The LA Times went down there and did a 4-part series on it, and they called him a liar. Now, but let's assume he did it.
Well, you and I both know
Just
the LA Times
just a
doesn't
moment.
always
Just a
report
moment, Mr.
accurately.
Rousselo. Just a moment. Let's assume Mr. McClellan did get the jobs. When did he do it?
The last year and a half.
After they burned the town down.
After who burned it down?
Whoever burned it down.
Oh, I see. Whoever.
Now, the point that I'm making, if Mr. McClellan is so concerned to prove that private effort, private industry, can resolve social problems, if he needed 20,000 jobs the day after Watts burned down, he needed them the day before it burned down. Why did they have to send up smoke signals for Mr. McClellan to find out where Watts is? That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, as you probably know, he knew where Watts was long before that, and as a matter of fact, I think something like 10% of the employees in his own plant were from Watts, so you can't say he didn't know where it was.
Yeah, he found it.
Yeah. He found it long before. He found it long before all of these, whatever they were, burned it down. You know, whatever. They didn't come from the conservative group, I can tell you that.
Well, I'll
The
tell you
people that
what.
burned it down.
I'll tell you what may interest you. You say they didn't come from the conservative group. It may interest you to know that the black nationalist, a Negro, who stood on the Joe Pine show and pulled a gun in the middle of the Watts riot, we were then live, the same man who came on my show and called me all kinds of names, the same man who stands up in Watts and talks about white people as if they are snakes and dogs, wound up the coordinator for the Ronald Reagan campaign in Watts. You may want to work with that one.
Well, I think that was a tragedy.
Really?
Yeah, I think he made a mistake. I don't know that. Who is it? What's the guy's name?
I'll give you his name after we
Yeah.
get off the mic.
Why do we have to get off the mic?
Because of the gun pullingism.
Well, but I mean,
I'll tell you who
he was in a Reagan campaign? Man, that was stupid.
Mr. Lomax, in his original...
If in fact he was.
Mr. Lomax, in his original statement, Mr. Rousselo objected to the presence of 500,000 men in Vietnam because LBJ had sent him over there without constitutional prerogative. Now, it seems to me the question of why we were there is much larger than is it within the framework of the Constitution. And I would like to have both you gentlemen's comments on the efficacy of being there and fighting communism in such a way. How will it affect the American democratic idea of conducting government?
Well, my views on this, I think, are fairly well known. We aren't there because Johnson sent us. Johnson is only the last in a long line of presidents, starting with Mr. Eisenhower.
Eisenhower, that's right.
Who
Made a mistake, a couple here and there.
who committed us to this line of policy. We are there out
And
of
Kennedy contributed to it
Indeed,
further.
he did.
Yes, he did.
We are there.
Bob Kennedy keeps forgetting that.
I think in '68 you'll have the chance to remind me.
Well.
Anyway,
I'll be glad to.
we are there really because of what conservatism, and this is what I was talking about this morning, conservative thinking has done to America. We are there out of what I call the theology of Americanism. That notion that we are God Almighty. That notion that somehow America has come to this point in history and is now mandated to go and stop communism at all cost. This is a real theological, revivalistic bent. And you young people had better watch this thing. Eisenhower, one of the few bright things he ever said, in his farewell address, he warned the nation about the danger of a combination of the military and industry, this military-industrial complex. And what we're involved in today is we are caught on a machine driven by the military-industrial complex. These guys in the Pentagon are madmen. And in the meantime, it is a boon for industry. I was in Bangkok, and you would think that you were walking down Wall Street. There's a great big sign in Bangkok, Thailand, saying, you have a friend at the Chase Manhattan Bank. Really, we have literally occupied Thailand. And incidentally, this is another lecture, we're already in another civil war in yet another Asian country, which is Thailand.
Which we should not be involved in.
And my new book is about this. Yeah. But I'm telling you.
And by the way, who owns the Chase Manhattan Bank?
Your friend?
My friend? Don't put him in my camp.
He's a Republican.
He's a liberal. He's
a Republican. He's a Republican.
He's a liberal. He's one of your guys. He's one of your guys.
Look, you take care of your people and I'll take care of my people, okay?
You take care of yours. He's a liberal. That's what the '64 convention was all about. He's one of your guys.
Now, if any of you want Nelson Rockefeller, you can have him, okay?
So, I mean, and he also has a few foundations that are promoting this. By the way, all his foundations were promoting the CIA dough.
And he's got some gold mines in South Africa, too. We should get into that one day.
Well, now let's answer the gentleman's question.
Well, I've said that I don't think we should be there at all.
Agreed.
Now that we are there, if he wants to know from me what I think we ought to do, I think we ought to, and I have to be realistic about this, but we aren't going to just pick up and go. That's just unrealistic. What can happen is that we would repair to what is generally called the Gavin theory and secure the Saigon Peninsula area and quit.
I would answer the gentleman's question by saying that I think it is important that the constitutional question be considered. I don't think that it has to be the all-encompassing thing, but it is an important consideration because if one government official or several of them can violate the Constitution, that is, without going to Congress to ask for permission to send and commit our troops to war, then others will do it and do it in greater context, and I think that's wrong. So to that degree, I think that it has been wrong from the beginning, from the day that Eisenhower committed, quote, advisors. Mm-hmm. Kennedy escalated it and continued to escalate it until the time that he left office, and then, well, and I don't mean that in an incorrect way, but until the assassination, his administration was in fact escalating the number of people of our troops and others committed. President Johnson, after committing himself in the campaign not to do it, did exactly the opposite, and of course he was planning to do it all during the campaign, which again brings us to the point that I think that every individual has a responsibility to put a check on government to make sure that it does not misuse the Constitution, which I charge has been done in this case, and I think it's important because if one president can do it, then others will do it.
In this connection, and on this point, Mr. Rousselo and I agree. Not only are we in Vietnam without constitutional process, but let me tell you something else. We drew up a thing called SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And it too, everything seems to have happened in 1954, came in 1954.
Yeah.
Now, in 1962, now this is not widely known, in 1962, the foreign minister of Thailand and Dean Rusk sat down and drew up a memorandum which reads in essence this way, that under the provisions of SEATO, governments who are members of SEATO have the right to act bilaterally. That was the first point. Two, that whatever bilateral action they agreed upon would be binding upon SEATO. Therefore, it would not be necessary for Dean Rusk to go to the Congress of the United States to get a ratification of what they planned to do. What did they do? You should get this thing. They drew up the secret agreement. They made a publicity release of the fact that they'd made an agreement.
A secret agreement?
They drew up an agreement.
Government by deceit.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And they committed America to the 9 air bases we now occupy in Thailand. They committed America, you young man, to die if necessary to defend the current government in Thailand from its own people.
And he had no right to do it.
And I don't want to be prolix, but I want to say this. Thailand has been under martial law for more than 10 years. The country has no constitution. Nobody has voted in 15 years almost, and it is a felony punishable by God knows what for more than 5 people, for as many as 5 people, to get together to talk politics. And you have been committed to die in defense of that military junta, and it's never been put before the Congress of the United States.
Well, that shouldn't be a surprise to us because Mr. Sylvester, who is a former Undersecretary, Deputy Secretary for the Pentagon and a so-called liberal, said to the press 2 years ago, we reserve the right to lie to the American people.
Right.
And this is what they're continuing to do. Now, this is our complaint as it comes to Mr. Rusk and some of the others, because they are lying to the American people just like the President of the United States is, and this is one area where I know we agree. Does that answer your question?
Not really. The question I wanted answered specifically is, since it is your interpretation seemed to say that since we are there illegally, or LBJ has sent us over there, one, what constitutes, in your opinion, the government? Does this include Congress and so on, which undoubtedly has given them some kind of authority? And secondly, should we fight communism there at all, or should we have 500,000 men there if they were sent through constitutional means?
I'll deal with that rather quickly. Number one, the Constitution clearly provides that Congress reserves the right for the declaration of war. The president can act in an emergency situation, but even then, it's subject to congressional action. He never has asked the Congress of the United States for war. This is why Lyndon Johnson had to bring Westmoreland home to make this speech to rally the nation. Johnson wouldn't dare go before Congress. Now, the second point, should we be fighting communism there? My own answer is no, and I'm not sure that's what you're fighting. In fact, I have for a year now been involved in the Vietnam thing. And what you're fighting in Vietnam is not really communism. You're fighting a kind of Vietnamese nationalism that takes one form in the north, another form in the south, and the North and the South Vietnamese, and I'm talking about the Viet Cong now when I say South Vietnamese, want entirely different kinds of things and will probably naturally divide when the time comes. I'm not sure that you're fighting communism there at all.
Well, I'm sure we wouldn't agree that the Viet Cong is a different kind of communism than that of North Vietnam. I
Yes, I
disagree
would.
with that. Well,
Yes,
we
I
have
would.
an honest disagreement on that.
Yes, I would.
But as it relates to your question, I still believe that the basic question that you raise is a very real one, and that the Congress, except for the so-called resolution of the Tonkin Gulf, which granted the President authority to use whatever means necessary, but when amendments were tried to be put into that, disallowing him the right of military commitment and so forth, this was finally knocked out because Dean Rusk insisted that our troops were fighting in South Vietnam today, not under the American flag, but under the SEATO agreements.
That's true.
And that's the main argument that they use, that our troops are not fighting under United States command, so-called, according to Mr. Rusk now, and of course I think he's just phony, is that they are fighting under SEATO agreements, of which we're not a signatory.
Who is it?
What, SEATO?
Yes.
Well, SEATO is a commitment of nations to protect themselves and
But you
carry
say
on
we are not a
economic-
signatory.
No.
Oh, come on, John.
No, we are not a signatory to the SEATO agreements as it relates to military commitment.
Oh, we are.
No, we are not.
Oh,
We
oh,
have
oh,
never committed ourselves in the SEATO agreement to military commitment. And so again, he's not telling us the truth, but you know, that's not new. We are not committed on a military basis. It's only economic.
The SEATO agreement, of course, as
And
I'm
of
sure
course,
you know.
is a regional agreement of the United Nations, right?
No.
Yes, it is.
No.
Yes, it is. Well,
The
we better
SEATO
have school right here then.
Okay, let's have school. The SEATO agreement.
SEATO agreement is a regional agreement under the United Nations Charter. If you look at it, it says so right in the preamble. That's right.
The SEATO agreement.
Just as NATO is, and so forth. And the ultimate authority of the SEATO command resides in the Security Council of the United Nations. They can veto anything in the SEATO action. Well, go check it. Don't take my word for it. Go check the charter.
Well, while I move in the hope that I have my notes from,
SEATO
Yeah,
charter with you?
in the hope that I have my notes with me.
Well, did we finish this poor gentleman's question?
Okay. Mr. Rousselo, you said that conservatives believe that citizens should put a check on their government.
Yes.
And if this is so, how can we as citizens put a check on our governor when he does things that we don't like cutting back mental health or continuing capital punishment or coming in and cleaning up the university and imposing tuition and firing the president or being instrumental in...
Well, there's several ways. First of all, the same way those of us who disagreed with Governor Brown and many of his stupid programs voted him out of office.
But that's in 4
You have the
years.
right every 4 years to change that through the voting process. Other ways that you can do it is to prevail upon your assemblyman or your state senator to not go along with programs that you disagree with. Other ways that you can do it is to challenge in court those things that you feel that he's done on an unconstitutional basis, if you feel that he has done that. There are many checks that we have against our governor or against any elected official. And I think that the answer to your question is that if I disagreed, I would follow any of those normal processes.
Could you comment, Mr. Lomax? How effective are those means?
You mean how effective are the elective process? I think it's very effective in the long run. That's how we got rid of Governor Brown, by 1 million votes. Evidently, and others agreed with us.
Yeah, I just so happen to have a copy of the SEATO Treaty. As to the signatories, there are 8 of them. Among them is a man named Dean Rusk, who signed for the United States.
That is not the original SEATO agreement.
It is.
No, it isn't. John Foster Dulles signed the original
I'm
agreement
sorry.
on part
Did
of
I say
SEATO.
Dean Rusk?
Yeah, you did.
I'm sorry. Who is it here for the United States?
This is a subsequent agreement.
No. But anyway, the point that I want to get to...
Anyway, you'll
No.
find that the SEATO agreement is a regional agreement under the United Nations Charter. And let me say, that's a basic fact.
Well, okay, we can
That's
argue
a
about
basic
that later.
fact.
It isn't germane to this, but these guys under SEATO do anything they want to,
Yes,
so long as
right.
they inform the United Nations they're going to do it.
That's right. And assuming that they don't veto their action,
Yep.
which they have, the Security Council has the power to veto actions of any of the regional agreements under the United Nations, SEATO, NATO, etc. So if the communists didn't like it, I assume they'd veto it. Possibility. They've used the veto before.
Mr. Lomax?
Yeah.
Did you hear my question? I was wondering if you could comment on how effective it is for people to use their congressmen or writing letters to try to convince Reagan some of the things he's doing we don't like.
They have to write their assemblyman on the government. Congress is something.
Well, I think the basic question you're raising is how effective is it to write your representative? I think it's very effective if it's done honestly and he doesn't get the impression that he's getting an organized thing that somebody is turning out a mimeograph machine. If he feels things on a mimeograph machine, if he feels that thousands of people are literally out of real gut feelings writing him, I think it's important.
I can say from my own personal experience in Congress, I considered my mail very important, both those who agreed and disagreed. And as a matter of fact, especially personally written letters from those who agreed or disagreed, I considered tremendously important in understanding my district. And I think most congressmen or state legislators, it would be the case in complaining about Governor Reagan. If you have a complaint to your assemblyman or state senator, this is the place to do it. And I think it is effective. It isn't as fast as it is, say, in a dictatorship, where if you're in power, you can get action very promptly. But I think in the long run, that our whole elective process is very good.
Mr. Rousselo, one of the two men in your life raft that you claim is a conservative that voted against Lyndon Baines Johnson is Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon has said that one of the major threats in America today is the protest against the war in Vietnam. Could you comment on this statement and the use of protest in America?
Well, if I gave the impression in that little story by saying, I didn't think you'd take it so seriously, that Vice President Nixon was conservative, I certainly was wrong, because I don't think Dick Nixon is conservative or liberal. I think he usually takes a position that he thinks is best for Dick Nixon. But I think that his complaint that those that protest in some of the ways they do. He's not talking about legitimate picketing or legitimate protests of letters or seeing a congressman or going to Congress and petitioning him and so forth. These are legitimate methods of petition and complaint. But the burning of draft cards, burning of flags, this type of thing gives the impression to the Viet Cong that we do not support or give general support to our men that are trying to fight in Vietnam. And I think that that was his interpretation of it, to be fair to him. Now, please don't misunderstand. I am not a spokesman for Richard Nixon. I'm sure he doesn't want me to be. So that...
Could you comment on this attitude, though?
I don't think he considers himself a conservative.
What is your own view? What is your own view?
Yeah, have you ever heard Dick Nixon say, I'm a conservative?
No, he just acts
No,
like it.
I don't.
But what is your own view, Mr. Rousselo?
My own view of what?
The protest against the
Oh,
war.
I think that any legitimate and legal and proper protest is absolutely right, and people should do it when they have a protest. My only disagreement is when laws are improperly violated, that's all. I think that laws that stand up in the court usually are considered proper laws. I'm not saying that all laws are proper. The laws, too, have to be challenged. For instance, we've often got into the argument about the laws of preventing...
How do you properly violate the law, to use your word?
Oh, I don't think you properly violate a law. I think you can challenge a law. Let's talk about a specific way to...
You are against improperly violating the law.
Right.
The implication of this is that there is a way to properly violate the law.
I think that there are proper... Maybe I didn't state it too well. I think that there are proper ways to challenge a law. For instance, I believe the laws they used to have...
Come on. Okay.
Well, I hope you don't mind if I change the word to make it more clear. I obviously hadn't clarified it for you, and I was trying to do it. I hope you won't get too upset. I will give you a very specific example of a way I think it's proper to challenge a law. There used to be laws, and probably still are in some areas, separate restrooms in the South in public buildings. I think that's not only incorrect, it's wrong, and many people challenge that by going into the public restaurant, being arrested, taken to court, and then challenging that law in the court. I think that's a proper way to do it. There were laws of drinking fountains and all this kind of thing. I think those were unconstitutional laws, improper, and somebody had to challenge them. And they did. But they did it in a proper, they didn't burn the whole building down to do it. You see what my point? Well, I think that, and I'm not.
I think he would say.
I think that our friend,
Yeah.
our friend Mohammed, or whatever his name is, he challenged the law correctly. He refused to take the oath because he said he could not do it in good conscience, stated his reasons, is now going through the court process to challenge that law. Now, to me, that's a proper way to do it. Does that make sense?
We'll have the next and last question from the microphone, please.
Yes, I'd like to direct my statements to Mr. Rousselo. You seem to be concerned with the apparent popularity of Governor Reagan and the apparent growing popularity of conservatism. Can't even pronounce it. It's so innocuous. Well, anyway, I would like to assert that it's not the popularity of conservatism that's becoming fashionable in California today. It's a reaction against realism. People aren't willing to face the facts anymore, and conservatism provides a nice, comfortable, warm place for everyone to hide and stick their heads. They
I don't
want to
think
face
conservatives.
the problems. Okay, and something else. I think that this
do you
is
want me
also.
to answer that and then come back?
Well, I think this is also manifested in our foreign policy. People are now more and more being satisfied with the reaction to something else. In other words, Reagan's election is a reaction to Brown. Our foreign policy is a reaction to communism. It's nothing positive. It seems to me that conservatism, as Mr. Lomax has pointed out, has roots that are basically negative. They have nothing constructive to offer the American people.
Oh, I disagree with you. Conservatism has a very positive base. I agree with you, though, very much that I think our foreign policy is very negative. This is one reason I many times voted against certain appropriations for overseas, because I could see that they were very negative and really it put money into dictators' hands and this kind of thing, which I don't think helps freedom any place. So I think that we would very much agree that our foreign policy has become very negative today. I would be in agreement with you on that. I disagree with you that Reagan's election was just total reaction to Governor Brown. I think it was an ineptitude also, and I think that Governor Reagan projected a more positive answer to several of the questions that were before us, and that's why that he got the vote that he did. And even though some of those were not popular, one thing he said is he would work and try to work to have, and I know this is very unpopular here, but still he at least has tried to fulfill his commitment to have part of the tuition cost paid by the student. And if the student couldn't afford it, that then loans would be made available. I think that he has tried the best he can. He's only one regent to follow through on that. I think that he did say before he was elected that he would phase out not the total mental health program, but certain parts of it that he felt were bureaucratic and unnecessary and were being handled adequately by city, county, and local governments, and that he has tried to fulfill that commitment. But anytime you try to turn bureaucracy around, John Kennedy tried to do it, change certain things. You always get reaction from those people that are entrenched in it, as you know.
John Kennedy
so
tried to
I don't think it should be just fashionable. I think it should be on the basis of what is right. And I think many people are turning to conservatism because they realize that the conservatives have been right on many issues.
No. Well, if I may make my final comment of the debate, it comes back to my essential point. I think you're right, young man. Conservatism does allow people a very comfortable little hideaway to get away from reality. They do not allow themselves a real view of the world. They will come up with such platitudinous things as the people in Watts should lift themselves up by their own bootstraps. And you've heard all of these kinds of things, and the greatest evidence of it is, again, this thing of money being the same, on the same par with people, or perhaps even above. Wait a minute.
We never made that statement.
I think it's inherent in just what you finished saying. Ronald Reagan ran and said he was going to do something about the budget. Well, he did. And if the purpose of government is to save money,
He hasn't done it.
this is what he's up to. But now, if the purpose of government is to serve the people, then we've got to look at it from a different point of view. I don't see where you can, this is exactly the crux of the problem. You can save money, if you really want to save money, abolish all of public education. If the, if the objective is to save money.
Now,
But
who said
if your,
that?
no, but I'm saying, if your
Yeah, but you've
objective,
implied.
just a moment, if your objective is to turn out in this state a generation of educated, alert young people to carry on the great tradition of this state, then I don't care if we go in debt. The greatest investment we can make is in human minds. And I can't see us in this state running around concerning ourselves with saving money at the expense of cutting out education and closing down mental hospitals for poor people who cannot help themselves.
First of all, I really should respond to this, but it'd probably take all day. The conservative point of view has never been money above people. Mr. Lomax knows that as well as we do. One of our concerns in the rising cost of government, people pay for that. It comes out of people's pockets. Now, we're all willing to sacrifice a portion of our income for worthy projects and for things that are needed at whatever given level. But some of us are getting tired of putting up taxes, and not just myself, but the general populace, and they're not hiding there. It's a very realistic approach. A very realistic approach. When Gus Hawkins tells us that the poverty program is doing little or nothing to help the poor people, that the urban renewal program moves out the slums and creates new homes that the rich people move into, and that the poor people get no benefit from it, then that is our complaint, that that money is not spent correctly or wisely. And that's what we're trying to check. We're not trying to say government has no right to spend money. My Lord, it spends it like it's going out of style. The check must come in individual citizens analyzing those programs and seeing if they're doing the job that the politician claims they're doing. Now, that was the argument with Governor Brown. He was, first of all, not just going into debt, but going into debt even more than he was telling his own people in his own party in the legislature. He was spending future money that belonged in other places. He was being dishonest even with his own party. Jess Unruh complained about this. So the complaint is not that we in any way want to deter charitable and rightful and correctful activities to help people. But who pays for this? People pay for this. You and I pay for it. And we want to be sure that that money is spent wisely and correctly, and that's where the difference is. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.